discovered that civil-military relations is filled with overlapping responsibilities, disagreements, hurt feelings, tantrums, periodic screaming matches. It wasn't a pretty sight. And the truth of the matter was that even discussing it made a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And I think the truth of it is, it still does. We don't like talking about civil-military relations. I think for many of us, both military and civilian alike, we sometimes tend to think that if you talk about civil-military relations, it kind of implies that the American military is poised to launch a coup, which it obviously isn't. And so it's much more fun to talk about strategy or even operations and tactics or technology, or if you're really into the details, logistics, anything but civil-military relations. And to make it worse, part of the problem in that course, and indeed in broader discussions, is that most of us tend to think that we know what the solution is. The solution is something like this, and in the book I say, well, this is the normal theory, if you will, of civil-military relations. But it's basically the idea that there's a kind of formula that we can all agree on. And the formula goes something like this. Of course, the politicians get to decide when the war starts and when the war ends. Of course, the politicians should be the one who should set objectives, decide what level of resources are available to the military, set some bounds for military action, determine who our allies, obviously who our enemies are, set policy lines for dealing with both, pick the most senior commanders, and if they are unhappy with them, relieve them. What's left for the military? Well, in a word, just about everything else. After all, they are professionals. And the civilians, and indeed the country, is best off when they allow their military advisors to give professional advice. And if they don't like the advice or the advisor, they should replace him. But, and on this there's almost universal consensus, they should not meddle, they should not micromanage, they should not interfere or pry. They should respect the independence of tactics and operations, and insofar as possible, try to confine themselves to either strategy or some people would say grand strategy. This view is summed up in a recent article in U.S. News and World Report, in which an anonymous retired four-star officer was quoted as saying, "Rumsfeld is smart enough to know that the way to run a war is to let the senior military know what the rules are and let the senior military run the war." Well, I'm not quite sure that Secretary Rumsfeld knows that, but that certainly is the view that most people have of how should it be done, how it should be done. How old is that view? Well, let's go back a bit. In fact, let's go way back to the Third Macedonian War and a speech given by Consul Lucius Aemilius, who was about to begin a campaign in Macedonia in 168 BC. The fact that this is the Third Macedonian War should tell you that the first two were not entirely successful. And this is his speech to the Roman Senate. He says, "Generals should receive advice, in the first place, from experts who are both specially skilled in military matters and have learned from experience, and secondly, from those who are on the scene of action, who see the terrain, the enemy, the fitness of the occasion, who are sharers in the danger, as it were, aboard the same vessel. Thus, if there is anyone who is confident that he can advise me as to the best advantage of the state in this campaign which I am about to conduct, let him not refuse his services to the state, but come with me into Macedonia. I will furnish him with his sea passage, with a horse, a tent, even travel funds. If anyone is reluctant to do this and prefers the leisure of the city to the hardships of campaigning, let him not steer the ship from on shore. The city itself provides subjects enough for his conversation. Let him confine his garrulity to these, and let him be aware that I shall be satisfied with the advice originating in camp." Well, Lucius Aemilius has had plenty of kindred spirits throughout history. President George W. Bush, number 41, speaking in his memoirs about the Gulf War. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell, ever the professional, wisely wanted to be sure that if we had to fight, we would do it right and not take half measures. He sought to ensure that there were sufficient troops for whatever option I wanted, and then the freedom of action to do the job once the political decision had been made. I was determined that our military would have both. I did not want to repeat the problems of the Vietnam War or numerous wars throughout history where the political leadership meddled with military operations. I would avoid micromanaging the military. And to bring it even more up to date, 1999, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations is holding hearings into the war fought by the United States and its NATO allies with Serbia. I was actually there testifying about the effects of air power in this and in other wars. And the senator chairing the hearing said that he was troubled by the extent to which political considerations were affecting military strategy. And he said, "I firmly believe in the need for civilian control of the military in a democratic society, but I also believe that we can effectively adhere to this critical principle by clearly outlining political objectives, and then within the boundary of those objectives, allowing the military commanders to design a strategy in order to assure the achievement of those objectives." So we have consensus. Now, the truth of the matter is that Titus Livy records that actually a surprisingly large number of senators took the consul up on his offer and went with him into Macedonia. And actually the Third Macedonian War was not the last. There was at least another one. And I think a careful historian would say that neither the Gulf War nor Allied force unfolded in quite the ways that President Bush or Senator Smith described, but you may think of those as quibbles. The question remains, why don't sensible people follow the formula that seemingly everybody agrees on? Because I assure you they rarely do. And the greatest wartime leaders of all, and in the book I talk about 4 of them, Abraham Lincoln, George Clemenceau, the Premier of France during World War I, Winston Churchill, and David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of the State of Israel, most certainly did not play by those rules. And in the time remaining, what I would like to do is to describe to you some of the ways in which they did not, and thereby show you what it seems to me some of the tasks of civilian wartime leadership really are. And to make the case that truly effective civilian wartime leadership invariably leads to friction and tension and what often feels a lot like micromanagement, second-guessing, and meddling. And what's worse, I'm going to suggest that those aren't such bad things.